The lawn outside my window is brown. It has been that way all summer, and I do not expect it to change anytime soon. We are living in a drought with water restrictions. If you live in Livermore, you probably received a card in the mail several months ago alerting us to these restrictions with lots of different requirements and options. Cutting back on lawn watering was one of the top requirements, and to tell you the truth, I've come not to mind it. I've come to appreciate my brown lawn and the ecological awareness that it signifies. Other people have taken even more drastic measures. Last week, I had dinner with a friend who began telling me about all of the measures that he has taken. He started to put a bucket of water under the shower head to catch the cold water that comes out before the spray heats up. He then uses that cold water to refill his fish tank and water his plants. That all seemed reasonable, and then he continued. After conserving the water in that bucket, he then jumps into the shower to get wet, turns off the water to put soap on, and only at the end turns the shower back on to quickly rinse himself off. My friend said that he has never thought about water in this way before the drought, but it has really raised his awareness. And I feel that I should be honest here and admit that I'm not quite as virtuous as my friend, even though I very much admire his conscientiousness. We celebrate water communion today, which is a ritual that goes back at least 30 years in our congregations. We pour water into a common bowl to signal the intermixing of our lives in this beloved congregation, and also our coming together for a new church year. Some people bring water from a place that is of significance to them. Others use water that the congregation provides. Now, I've been thinking of the meaning of this ritual in the midst of drought. A few Unitarian Universalist congregations have decided not to do the ritual this year, as it seems like a trivial waste in the midst of so much need. I view it somewhat differently. I think that it shows how sacred and how life-giving we affirm this water to be by making it a centering ritual for the beginning of the church year. And hopefully, in so doing, it raises to consciousness and helps encourage us to make changes in how we honor this life-giving substance in other parts of our lives. I also think that it is appropriate that in this time of drought, the water that we use today for this tradition will be given to the thirsty plants in our church garden. But water communion in a time of drought does raise a question. It raises an awareness. It is the question of whether there will be enough. It is a familiar dynamic of having and not having, of feast and of famine, a dynamic that many of us face in our day-to-day lives, and still others contemplate as being out in the world. Some of us may have to ask, will I have enough for my family in the coming months or year? Others may wonder on a larger scale, at the rate that we're using natural resources, will there be enough for our children? Are we naively feasting before a great famine? And how are we to know? Part of this, no doubt, has to do with temperament. What people view as feast or famine varies dramatically person to person. I bet that we all know people who hoard resources to an excessive degree. Perhaps they are people who grew up during a difficult economic time, always prepared for the next disaster that never quite seems to arrive. They stockpile sugar packets and they reuse every container that comes within their reach. I know a few of these people. And then there are others who cannot seem to hold on to any resources. Money burns a hole in their pocket as soon as they get a hold of it. Think along the lines of celebrities from the 80s and 90s who, having wealth in the millions and assuming no end to their income, have by now squandered it and have nothing. The question of whether there will be enough is not only about individual temperament, of course. The events that we try to prepare ourselves for can be volatile and hard to predict. I'm sure that there were people who thought that their investments were sound, even cautious, on the eve of October 1929. It didn't matter. The crash of the stock market took it all away. Other people, assuming an upcoming famine or even apocalyptic end, quit their jobs and sold everything, assuming that none of it would matter. The followers of Harold Camping did this as recently as 2011 and were no doubt shocked and bewildered when the world did not meet its expected end. Are we living on the verge of feast or famine? How are we to know? How are we to prepare? The Hebrew Scriptures tells a story that gets at this notion. It takes place in ancient Egypt and is a story about the figure of Joseph, one of the patriarchs of Israel. As the story tells it, the Pharaoh of Egypt had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, these ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing from a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy, full heads. Then the Pharaoh woke up. In the morning, his mind was quite troubled by these dreams, so he sent for all of the magicians and the wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. The Pharaoh eventually calls for Joseph, who had been held in the palace dungeon. The Pharaoh communicates the dream to him and asks for an interpretation. This is what Joseph says. The 2 dreams are one and the same. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. The 7 lean, ugly cows that come up afterwards are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is a warning, in other words, advising Egypt to prepare itself. Joseph thinks about the situation for a moment and then offers his advice to the Pharaoh. He says, "You should look for a discerning and wise person to put in charge of the land of Egypt. He should appoint commissioners over the land and take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all of the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come to Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by starvation." The story ends with Joseph becoming that appointed person, wisely ruling Egypt through both the time of plenty and the time of famine. The story strikes me very much as saying something about how we human beings seek certainty in the midst of an uncertain future. We want to know whether we are headed for feast or for famine. And so we try to read the dreams or the tea leaves or the stock market reports looking for omens and portents that alert us to coming successes or disasters. In the story, Joseph is something like an ancient market speculator, offering up his predictions on when the next economic downturn is to take place. But what makes Joseph successful is that he is something like an inside trader. He actually has the scoop from God about how things are going to go. And to be honest, I think that speaks more to a wish that we have as human beings than it does an actual thing that someone might have access to. As much as we wish we did have some sort of exclusive insight into the future, we don't. We simply do not know. We are not insider traders with God or with the future. The future remains open and uncertain. So what do we do with all of this? If the future is open and we cannot be certain whether we are living on the verge of feast or famine, what advice is there? I'd like to shift the conversation a little bit and change the question. Rather than asking, do I have enough, and when will the next feast or famine occur, I would like to ask, how can we care for what has been given to us? How can we care for what has been given to us? I take my cue from the Haitian wisdom story that Casey read this morning. In it, as you may recall, a lizard becomes overprotective of the well that was entrusted to her on behalf of the community. The animals surrounding the well become thirsty because the lizard refuses to grant them access. The gist of the story is that the lizard was never meant to take ownership of the well, but rather was only meant to be a steward of the resource. In the story, God intervenes, saying that the water belongs to no one person, but rather to all of earth's creatures. From that point forward, stewardship of the water is handed over to everyone. This story does not rely on an accurate prediction of the future, nor does it assume that a single person can rule over some sort of natural resource. Instead, it suggests that we are all given the gift and the responsibility of caring for our natural resources for this common world that we love together. To me, the story says, much of what we have before us is a gift that we did not create, nor does it belong to us. But it is ours to care for through feast and famine, through downpour and drought, through joy and through sorrow. I believe that this is one of the purposes of the church, to remind us of our participation in this larger interconnected web, to recall us to our basic responsibilities of caring for the life that we have been so graciously given. And I think that's a good note on which to start this church year. My spiritual companions, welcome to this common, beloved place. Amen.